I was 22 when I first saw him. No, really saw him, for the first time. It was in a way I can't quite explain, like the world had been operating in muted colors until that exact moment. The air around us was thick with the unspoken, the unsaid. I had always thought I knew myself, what I wanted and who I was, until the one thing I had never anticipated, him, entered my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was the kind of day that feels like an ordinary Wednesday, the kind where you think nothing could possibly go wrong, and yet everything begins to unravel. I remember standing at the bus stop, my mind preoccupied with the usual noise of life, work, bills, social obligations, and then I saw him. He was standing across the street, a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes lost in thought. It wasn't the way he looked at me that caught my attention. It was the fact that for the first time I couldn't look away. There was something about him, something quietly magnetic. Our eyes locked for what felt like an eternity, and I knew, deep down, something had shifted. But I shrugged it off. I had never been the type to let these things consume me. I had my life, my path. That's what I believed. But as I boarded the bus, something inside me twisted. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, more visceral, and it scared the hell out of me. I remember pulling my phone out, pretending to scroll, but really, I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. The whole bus ride was a blur. The chatter, the motion, the stops, it all melted into the background. All I could focus on was the fact that I had never felt so disoriented by a single moment before. Later that night, when I was lying in bed, I kept replaying it in my mind. The feeling of my heart pounding as our eyes met, the strange flutter in my stomach that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. I tried to brush it off. It's nothing, I told myself, just a passing thought. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. And the worst part was, I couldn't understand it. I had never been attracted to men, not like this. I had always thought of myself as someone who could never entertain the idea, someone who was sure of his identity. But in that moment, everything felt uncertain, as if I had been handed a mirror I wasn't ready to look into. It wasn't until the following week that I ran into him again, and this time, the encounter would break me open in ways I didn't even know were possible. It happened on a late Friday evening, a time when most people were winding down for the weekend, but I found myself heading home after another long day at work. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the air was crisp, reminding me that the fall had begun to settle in. I was walking down the sidewalk when I heard a voice call my name. I turned instinctively, and there he was again, standing across the street, looking just as out of place as I felt. His name was Illy, and I didn't know it at the time, but he had been watching me too. He waved, an awkward, shy gesture, and I froze. My mind was spinning, unsure of how to react. What was this? Was this some weird coincidence, or was I simply reading too much into things? As if answering my silent question, Ellie crossed the street and stood in front of me, the same cigarette dangling from his fingers, the same distant look in his eyes. "Hey," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of something unsaid. For a moment, I just stood there, caught between wanting to run and wanting to know why the universe seemed to be pushing him into my path. "Hi," I managed to say, the word falling out awkwardly, like I was the one who didn't know how to be normal. There was an uncomfortable silence before he spoke again. "I don't know if you remember me from the other day, at the bus stop." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Yeah, he trailed off, scratching the back of his head as if he didn't know how to continue either. And then, unexpectedly, Ellie smiled. It wasn't a forced smile, but one that seemed to break through the walls he had built around himself. "I'm sorry if I weirded you out," he said, looking at the ground. "I don't usually do this, but there's something about you that felt different and I couldn't stop thinking about it." The honesty in his voice was disarming. My heart raced again, not out of fear, but something more complex, something I didn't understand. There was a pause, a moment where everything could have ended with a casual goodbye, but instead I found myself saying, "It's okay, I've been thinking about you too." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and the shock of hearing myself admit it made my breath catch. There it was, the truth that had been gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, too loud now to ignore. The air between us felt charged, crackling with the weight of everything unsaid. And just like that, my world tilted, upside down, inside out. And I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. But it was in the next few moments, the few that followed, that everything began to unravel faster than I could ever anticipate. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving, neither of us knowing exactly what to do next. Illy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, still fumbling with his cigarette, clearly unsure whether to put it out or to say something else. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for either. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered, but there was something undeniable about the pull between us. And then, as if fate itself had decided to step in, he did the last thing I expected. He took a deep breath and with a half smile said, "I don't want to rush anything, but would you like to grab a coffee, just talk?" I stood there, blinking, the invitation hanging in the air like a lifeline. I wanted to say yes, to accept, to take that first step into something unknown. But something inside me recoiled, not out of fear of him, but of myself. I had spent so long building walls around my own identity, convincing myself that my life was neatly organized, compartmentalized, that the thought of stepping out of those boundaries felt overwhelming. But before I could respond, a car drove by, blaring music, and I flinched, momentarily snapped out of the daze I was in. Illy noticed my hesitation. His expression softened, and he lowered his hand as if he understood everything without me having to say a word. "No pressure," he murmured. I don't want to pretend that this is nothing. You know." The sincerity in his voice was like a mirror, reflecting everything I had buried deep inside me. For the first time in my life, I realized that this wasn't just about attraction. It was about something deeper, something I had always been too afraid to acknowledge. But then, as I opened my mouth to respond, something inside me snapped. I didn't know where it came from, but a wave of emotions crashed over me, fear, anger, confusion, all at once. The self-doubt I'd been harboring for so long came to the surface. "Why are you doing this?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. "Why now? Why me?" My words tumbled out in a rush, a mix of frustration and vulnerability I had never allowed myself to express. Illy's face softened, his eyes searching mine as if he could see right through me. "Because," he said quietly, "I don't know how to explain it, but when I saw you that day, when I saw you again just now, it felt like I'd been waiting for this moment, even if I didn't know it." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine, and suddenly everything felt impossibly intimate. "I don't expect you to have it all figured out," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe we can figure it out together." That was the moment I realized that I wasn't just in love with him. I was in love with everything that came with the uncertainty he brought into my life. I was in love with the idea that I could be more than I had ever allowed myself to be. And yet, it terrified me. It terrified me because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure who I was without the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself. And I didn't know if I was ready to let them crumble. I couldn't bring myself to answer right away. His words hung in the air like a dangerous promise, something both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering if the wind would carry me or push me over the edge. Illy, standing so close now, seemed to sense my internal struggle. He didn't press me for a response. Instead, he just stood there, waiting as though he knew the depth of the battle inside me. His presence was oddly comforting, but also a reminder that the life I'd been living, the life I thought was mine, was no longer enough. I could feel the weight of everything that was about to change, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine in a touch so light it felt like an accident, but I knew it wasn't. My pulse quickened at the mere contact, and it was as if every single decision I'd made in my life had led me to this very moment, to this choice I was now forced to confront. What if I let myself go? What if I stepped into something that could break me open in ways I could never put back together? Or worse, what if I didn't step forward? Would I spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been? The questions overwhelmed me, and the noise in my mind drowned out the city sounds around us. I had always thought of myself as someone who knew where they were going. I had carefully crafted my identity over the years. This is who I am. This is who I love. This is my future. But in that moment, standing in front of Illy, all those carefully constructed walls felt like they were crumbling. I had built a life I thought I could rely on, a life that was comfortable, predictable, but also suffocating. And Illy, with his quiet intensity, had shattered all of that. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was being forced to confront the parts of myself I had buried deep, convinced that if I ignored them long enough, they would go away. "I don't know what this is," I finally said, my voice trembling, the truth breaking through the fog in my chest. "But I feel it. I feel everything changing, and I'm scared, Illy." There it was, the raw honesty that I had spent my whole life avoiding. I had never been this vulnerable with anyone, not even myself. "I don't know how to be this person, how to be with you, how to even understand what this means, but I can't pretend it's nothing, not anymore." My chest tightened as the words spilled out, every sentence more fragile than the last. Illy didn't say anything for a long time, and for a moment I thought I had said too much. But then he took a slow step toward me, his eyes softening. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said, his voice low yet firm. "But you don't have to be scared either. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, as the words settled between us, something inside me finally clicked. I understood that love wasn't about having all the answers. It was about taking that leap, taking it together with all the uncertainty, all the fear, and trusting that maybe, just maybe, it would all work out. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I was ready for the full weight of that realization. And the worst part, I didn't know if I ever would be. The weeks that followed were a blur, moments of quiet revelation intertwined with paralyzing uncertainty. Illy and I spent more time together, sometimes talking for hours, other times sitting in silence, letting our shared presence fill the space. I began to see sides of him I hadn't noticed before, his vulnerability, his need for connection, his own fears that mirrored mine. He wasn't perfect, but somehow that made him even more real. There was a rawness in him that was impossible to ignore, and for the first time, I found myself letting my guard down. I had spent years living in the comfort of my own emotional isolation, but with him, I didn't feel the need to protect myself. With Illy, it felt like I was being invited to exist without the weight of expectations or self-imposed limitations. But even as I let myself get closer to him, something shifted in me. There were moments of deep connection, moments that made me feel like I had found something I didn't know I needed, and then there were moments when I would pull away, subtly, quietly, when the overwhelming fear crept in. I'd find myself questioning everything I had believed about who I was, about what love should be. Was I really in love with him, or was I just afraid of the life I had built falling apart? Could I truly be who I was with him, without feeling like I was betraying everything I had worked so hard to define? Then, one night, everything changed in a way I never saw coming. I had spent the evening at his apartment, laughing, talking about our pasts, our childhoods, the things that made us who we were. It felt like we were building something new, something sacred. But then, as I was leaving, Ali stopped me at the door, his hand resting gently on my arm. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Something in his tone immediately sent a chill down my spine, and I turned to face him, bracing myself for what I wasn't prepared to hear. "I think you're afraid of me," he said, his eyes intense yet somehow soft, as if he already knew the answer. "Not because of anything I've done, but because of what I represent, what we are. I'm not a phase, and I'm not something you can just push away when it gets too real." The words hit me like a punch, the truth of them reverberating in the silence between us. For the first time, I felt like he had seen straight through me into the parts of myself I was still hiding. The weight of it was unbearable, but I couldn't deny the truth in his words. And that was when it hit me, the full force of the realization that had been building since the first moment we met. This wasn't just about him. It was about me. About what I had been running from for so long, the parts of myself I hadn't been willing to face. I had spent years convincing myself that I was someone I wasn't, afraid of a truth I had buried so deep that it had begun to suffocate me. I had been so terrified of what loving him meant that I had neglected to see what it meant for me, to finally be true to who I really was, to step into the unknown and take that leap without knowing where I would land. As I stood there staring at Ali, everything shifted. The fear, the hesitation, it all dissolved into something new, something terrifying but beautiful. I understood now that loving him wasn't just about the love we shared. It was about the love I needed to find for myself. That moment, that truth, cracked open everything I thought I knew about myself and about love. And in that instant, I knew that my life would never be the same again. But what I didn't expect was that the hardest part wouldn't be falling in love with him. It would be learning to fall in love with myself. And that was the moment I realized, deep down, that everything I had believed before had been leading me to this. The moment I truly understood what it meant to be free.